Dr. Berger, faculty, distinguished visitors, welcome to our symposium from here and from there. Media representations of conflicts in divided societies. And at this occasion, I would like to also remind you, kindly close all electronic devices so that we can proceed with our symposium. According to the Uppsala University Data Bank, there were in 2011 37 conflicts, which included also 6 wars. And of course, as we all know, we live in an area of conflict. And within the past 2 decades, without counting the Israeli-Arab permutations of conflicts, there have been close to 40 different conflicts in the Middle East itself. But today, we shall not deal with the historical and political and military causes of conflict, but rather with how these conflicts are reflected in the media of divided societies. The interface between the media in its broadest sense and conflict. How do the media and divided societies perceive conflict? And how may the media also serve as a tool to bridge gaps? By viewing how other divided societies view or perceive conflict beyond their own borders, we may perhaps gain better insight into the conflicts which confront us more directly. We are fortunate to have a panel of outstanding academics and media professionals. And before, I will of course introduce them at greater length before they actually speak, but I would just like at this point to recognize Professor Nico Carpentier of the Free University of Brussels, Dr. Vaia Doudaki of the Cyprus University of Technology, both of whom are presidential scholars in residence at the College of Management, which is part of our international outreach. I'd also like to present Professor Philip Hopper, photojournalist, lecturer, who's currently on a Fulbright scholarship at Al-Quds University. And at this juncture, I would like to thank the Embassy of the United States of America, and in particular, Ms. Ruth Ish Horowitz, for having facilitated his appearance here today. We have with us also Ms. Natalia Kanievsky, Call Israel news anchor and editor, who herself comes from the conflict-ridden Ukraine. And of course, Professor Hillel Nosek, Dean of the School of Media Studies, who in a short moment will give the opening remarks. Some of the issues which the distinguished panel may address are: what are the images of the other and self in societies of conflict? How do the traditional, digital, alternative, community media, and vernacular art cover or present conflicts within and beyond the borders of divided societies? And do these media have the power of bridging gaps and constituting a reconciliation or healing process? How do conditions on the ground affect press coverage and freedom of the press? Do the populations of divided societies view the conflicts differently than do the press? Our panel, of course, will be addressing the topics relating to their own research, but also to their observation of living, working in areas of conflict and divided societies. I would like to invite now Professor Hillel Nosek, Dean of the School of Media Studies, who needs no introduction, to give opening remarks. As we know, he has been, of course, not only a professor, but also an administrator, head of our authorities for research and teaching. He is also co-chairman of the Psychology and Public Opinion section of the International Association for Media. And he's published widely on all aspects of media and also culture and political violence. And I'll just cite one book which he has co-edited, Media and Political Violence, which came out. It is my pleasure to present Professor Nosek.
תודה רבה ליהודה. אני אפתח בכמה מילים בעברית ואני אעבור אחר כך לאנגלית. I'll start with some words in Hebrew and then turn to English. אז בוקר טוב לכולם, ואני מקווה שכל מי שנמצא כאן ייהנה ויפיק תובנות מהמפגש הזה. קודם כל אני רוצה לומר שהמפגש הזה הוא חלק מתהליך שבית הספר התחיל בו כבר לפני מספר שנים, כחלק מתהליך של המכללה כולה, של בינאום נקרא לזה, אבל לא גם האום, אבל בכלל, בינלאומיות, הייתי אומר, של המסלול, של המכללה, המסלול האקדמי, עם כוונות כמובן לשתף פעולה עם בתי ספר אחרים בעולם, והתהליך הזה, כפי שאמרתי, התחיל, ואנחנו שמחים להמשיך את התהליך הזה שהתחיל בשנים הקודמות של בית הספר. האורחים יהיו איתנו גם במפגשים עם כיתות שונות, עם מרצים, ואנחנו מקווים לפתח גם שיתופי פעולה מחקריים ושיתופי פעולה לימודיים. וזאת ההזדמנות כמובן להודות לכל מי שטרח ועמל גם על הביקור וגם על המושב, הסימפוזיון הזה, בראש ובראשונה לנשיא המכללה שהקים קרן מיוחדת לטובת אירוח מרצים אורחים, ולמי שאחראית על היחסים הבינלאומי של המכללה, הגברת נועה דוד, וכמובן הצוות שלנו, הגברת סימי שריג, שרון אשכנזי, וכל מי שטרח מסביב לארגון של המושב הזה, והמורים כמובן שנמצאים איתנו כאן, כל אחד בחלקו, וליהודה, וכמובן לשגרירות האמריקאית ולקרן פולברייט שעזרו לנו, ולנטליה שבאה בזכות עצמה. אז עכשיו אני אעבור לכמה מילים באנגלית. I welcome our guests and panelists for their agreeing to come and share with us their work on media and conflict in divided societies. As Yehuda said, we might gain some insights into those processes, even though we are involved in conflict, if you want, for many, many years. But I think looking from the outside, that's the reason for the name. What you see from here, maybe you don't see from there, or you see it otherwise. I want just, because of the time, I shorten my presentation, since you have, most of you, the chance to hear me in Hebrew, usually. I just add some theoretical perspective to what we're going to see, and maybe some look into the insight that we can draw from the presentation. First of all, when we studied the first Intifada with Cohen and Adoni, we used some criteria to understand conflicts, the way conflicts are presented in the media. There are three dimensions, I would say, and we can pay attention to them. One is complexity, how much we know about, how much the media presents the complexity of conflicts. The second, and the historical background, and the second one is intensity, how much it is presented, the violence, the vocal violence, the video violence, and the level of violence is is mostly represented in the media, even though sometimes the level might be lower. And the third one, which is most, I would say, complex, is what we call solvability. What does the media contribute to understanding what will happen with? So by paying attention to the presentations from Belgium, the way they look at the Iraq War, the first Gulf War, by paying attention to what we learn about Cyprus, the two divided communities, what we learn about Ireland and about us and the Palestinians, and what we learn about different divided societies in Ukraine and other USSR, previous USSR areas. We might pay attention to the complexity, the intensity, and the solvability, and how the media maybe can do something, the new media, the small media, the alternative media, can do something to communicate and not just to present the conflicts. So we have some ideas here. But what we can learn maybe, and just want to sum up a big project that I took part, which was the coverage of climate change. The coverage of climate change is a global conflict, if you want. Who will contribute? Who will do his share by saving the world and the life of our world, the life of our world? And we try to see how foreign news are covering this conflict in the world. And I want to sum up, to read you the sum up of the research on the news flow of global change that might give a frame to what we hear. I believe that what we will be hearing will be a counter flow to the flaws of news flow. There are well-developed traditions presenting evidence about the permanence of structures of information flows globally. Contours of coverage can be reduced to the macro power hierarchies of international politics. The global is defined as the center and the distributed as common. More locally, domestication research shows news organizations read the world from their local national perspective. Although these approaches might at first seem contradictory, this is necessarily not so. The ideological hegemonic global is often compatible with a national frame of domestication. The us and them perspective is present in local elite presentation, hegemonic presentation usually, and the national and international frameworks. What I think we're going to hear in the presentations here is a contraflow. How the media and other communication tools can, if you want, come from the underground and try to change the structural national elite media presentation of conflicts. So without much ado, I give you the lead.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Nosek, the way. And Professor Nico Carpentier is an associate professor of communication studies in the Free University of Brussels. He also lectures at Charles University in Prague. He is vice president of the European Communication Research and Education Association, and his research is varied. It deals with media, journalism, politics, democracy, war and conflict, and also community and alternative media. He has published widely. Among his books is Understanding Alternative Media, and just this last year he published another one, Media and Participation, a site of ideological democratic struggle. He's also edited in special issues of Telematics and Informatics, which were dedicated to communities, to community media. It is my pleasure to invite Professor Carpentier to discuss the issue of how the media in Belgium covered the Gulf War. Professor Carpentier.
It is a true pleasure, and of course, working with you and talking with you has been also within the framework of the INCR has been a true pleasure. So thank you for inviting us here. Oh, there's a microphone. And also thank you for the kind words in the introduction. I think that was also very, very kind of you. Having said that, these are of course not obligatory starting words. They came from the heart, as one can say. I want to take you to Belgium and the way that the Belgian media have covered the Iraqi war, as it's called. Now, you undoubtedly know Belgium. You've been there, spent lots of time there, so there's no need for me to explain how the country looks like. It is a very nice illustration, though, as a country, that there is a difference between conflict and violent conflict. And I think Mel's introduction was really important at that level in explaining that there is a structural difference between conflict on the one hand and violent conflict on the other. Other societies are characterized by conflict, and that also clearly applies to a country like Belgium. The issue of divided society, well, the country hasn't split up into two pieces or more yet. There's some talk about that, but I'll save you that story. That's a different lecture. But we are very much, as a country, I think, aware of the risk of becoming a more divided society than ever before. But again, the country has a very long tradition of classification of the conflict within that country. One other thing I have to explain before starting my story is that in the case of the Iraqi war, Belgium was one of the countries that was strongly opposed to that war. It was clearly one of the countries that took a very strong position there. On the other hand, we should not forget that it's also a very small country, which means that its voice doesn't weigh that significantly on the international stage. But the story I want to tell you here and now is basically a story about ideology. And what I want to try to argue is that if we look at conflict, if we look at media representation of conflict, but if we look at conflict as a whole, ideology is one of the key forces in trying to understand conflict. And there's a wonderful quote, and it's actually on the slide, and it sort of describes it all, so we can all read it and go home or listen to the next speaker. In the beginning, we create the enemy. Before the weapon comes the image. We think others to death and then invent the battle axe or the ballistic missiles with which to actually kill them. And that's the very short summary of the talk I want to have here. It is about our intellectual frameworks in relationship to conflict and war. And these, I would argue, these intellectual frameworks, or what I call the ideological model of war, is based on a set of dichotomies. It is the way we think about the enemy through what is called in discourse theory an equivalential chain. We consider ourselves as good, just, innocent, rational, civilized, and the list goes on, while the other is our constitutive outside. And that other is evil, unjust, guilty, irrational, uncivilized, and again the list goes on. So the way that the self and the enemy is structured in that ideological model of war is through these basic dichotomies. Now I should add a very quick warning sign. This ideological model of war is not necessarily stable. It can change over time. It can be actually quite fluid, but at the same time I would argue that it seems to be quite dominant in the way that we think about conflict and violent conflict. Media play a crucial role, not just in distributing that ideological model of war, but also co-producing it, adding to it, playing a key role in hegemonizing this ideological model of war. And the other, of course, basic assumption behind that statement is that journalism is not outside ideology. It wants to be in some cases, but it's extremely difficult for journalism to move outside this dominant way of thinking within a society. And that means that journalism also is infected, so to speak, by this ideological model of war. But at the same time, if we start to think about how this ideological model of war works, what we can also see is that there are a lot of practical problems that explain why journalism strengthens this ideological model of war. There are a number of practical problems related to journalism that is contributing to that hegemonization of the ideological model of war. And what I want to do is take you to that Belgian case study for a number of reasons. First of all, Belgium was outside that war, but in some strange way it became still very much part of it. It was still defining itself as part of the self against the enemy. So that is an interesting case. A country that's not at war is still part and is partially producing that ideological discourse of war. And I want to show you, secondly, how a number of practical problems related to journalism, the way journalism functions, actually contributes to that ideological model of war. So let us go to the, well, I called it here the third Gulf War. There's an interesting counting issue where I won't go. Is it the second one or the third one? Ironically, the Iraqi-Iranian war is usually not considered to be a Persian Gulf War, so it's never counted. For some strange reason, when there's no Western involvement, one could argue it doesn't count. So, well, it's something to think about. So I made it Gulf number 3. I want to take you to Belgian media, to be more specific to the North Belgium media, to television, news, broadcasts, the public broadcaster, VRT, and the main commercial broadcaster, VTM. They have main news broadcasts, which are fairly similar, actually. There's not that much of a difference between these two. And I want to use them as a case study to show you how this ideological model of war, how these dichotomies are actually present in the representation of the Iraqi war. I don't think I have to go into the history of this war. That will take too long. I think also you know the basics. I want to illustrate the analysis by focusing on one specific news broadcast, and that's the broadcast on April 7th. That is actually very close to the end of the actual first phase of the armed conflict, one could say. If we look at the way that the Belgian media cover the conflict, the March-April phase of the conflict, to be in 2003, to be more accurate, we see 3 phases. There's a lot of attention for the opening days of the conflict, and then you see a huge decrease of attention. It slows down, but then the battle for Baghdad starts, and then you see the increase. And that's the 3 stages which you can see, but the attention is actually at the maximum in the very first period of mid-March. Anyway, but I want to focus on these dichotomies. How are they represented? If I look at my one example, well, these are what is commonly known in academic jargon. These are the good guys. British and American forces are represented as in full control. They're relaxed, they're at ease, they are represented as heroic and masculine. I think if you look at the picture down here, it shows you a nice case of masculinity. I'm not going to go into gender analysis, but I do think that this is a very, very clear case. At the same time, on the other side of the slide, you see the British forces being welcomed in Basra. You see the thumbs up, right? The little kid saying welcome. So this is one of the representations of the self. It is clearly the representation of the good guys. We see a lot of emphasis on the new Iraq that will come out of this conflict. It's the creation of a new and better Iraq. Religious freedom will be installed. Political leaders are arriving again back into the country, so there is this idea of the new Iraq that's coming into being. On the other side, the evilness of the regime is emphasized in a number of particular ways. These are, again, in academic jargon, commonly referred to as the bad guys. And just a quick footnote, what I do not want to emphasize here, what I don't want to do here is to take a specific side. I'm not going to make any claims about how good the Saddam regime was, obviously not. But if we look at the way that the regime is represented, it is personified into the person of Saddam Hussein, and there's a lot of emphasis on the palaces. I've never seen so many golden tabs in one news broadcast. The golden tabs signify the corruption of the regime. That is the logics of the representation. That is the way how the regime is represented in combination with a series of representations that emphasize the fanatic nature of the Iraqi forces, its extreme violent nature, and how dangerous it is. The images of Halabja are continuously used to support that argument. More in general, we see a very, very strong emphasis on, again, looking at the good side, we see a very strong emphasis on the heroic nature of the Western American and British forces. Especially pilots are seen as what I would like to call the heroes of technology. They master very sophisticated technologies and use these technologies to strike in a very controlled way, aiding the liberation of the country. There's a very strong emphasis on technology, and this is one of the videos shown in the commercial news broadcast. Now, just to point your attention to a couple of things that are missing here in this series of screenshots. There's no city. There's only one building, and that one building is destroyed. There is no other person visible in this animation. It is only the building that is destroyed. And this was actually shown on a news broadcast to show how cruise missiles actually work. The other side, what we see more in general, are Iraqi soldiers which are represented as, and I would call that, absently present. They're there, but you can't see them. They're not human beings. They're very, very invisible. They only become visible when they're captured, when they stop being a soldier. Then they become humanized. Before that, they are not. They're seen as a threat to the Allied forces, and obviously, as you know, there was a lot of emphasis on the chemical threat. Whenever there is a gas mask being found, it's being shown, it's being screened on these news broadcasts to show the link to that threat. The second point I want to make is that specific journalistic conventions contribute to this way of representing the conflict. One has to do with the way that balance is being defined. Balance is being defined as having key politicians and military leaders talking to the Belgian audiences. So balance is achieved by having El Sahaf talk together with representatives of the British Armed Forces, the American Armed Forces, British politicians. So we get a very specific discourse of war because all the warring parties are being interviewed or being screened. The way that relevance and context is being articulated is again specific. Who is providing context? Military experts. These are again people that use the very specific discourse of war. We see the geography of war. We see a lot of maps. We see an uninterrupted flow of events being narrated. And we see a fascination for the technology of death and destruction. Over there you see three screenshots from a little animation they used, and you see the little tank actually driving into Baghdad. That's the way war is represented, as a specific kind of geography. This is an illustration of the narration of war as a flow. Day 19 of the war. So it's actually the covering the different events related to the notion of a flow. And we have specific articulations of truth. In many cases, they do not spend a lot of time on checking and double checking their sources. Source diversity is not that much an issue. This is one talk between, it's a discussion between the anchor in the VRT News, Public Broadcasting News, together with the correspondent in the US. And there's a lot of emphasis on how chemical weapons have been found, how there is actually evidence for the existence of weapons of mass destruction. After some time, it turns out that this kind of coverage is plainly wrong. And still, this is being presented as truth, even on April 7th. Do I want to claim that there's nothing but this dichotomized version of war? No, there were exceptions. This is a quick interview that we get to see with a driver, and he's saying, of course we are happy, why not, but this is actually not the way we want it. The Americans and the British are allowed to free Iraq, but they cannot stay. And this is a slightly different discourse that we are being presented. There is a lot of emphasis on, in the Belgian news broadcast, there's a lot of emphasis on the victims of war and on the different kinds of protests. In some cases, up to 20% of the news coverage is actually about the protest against the war. So let me conclude. What we get to see, even in the Belgian case, is a very dichotomized reality where this ideological discourse of war is very present, even in the case of a country that is not involved in the conflict itself. So this ideological discourse of war, based on these dichotomies, is very, very present in the coverage. That has to do with the way that news narrates war, it has to do with the ways that news contextualizes war, and it has to do with the way that the narration is being constructed as this uninterrupted flow. Well, we pay a price for that, and that price is the decontextualization in space and time of the conflict. The complicated causes, I think you referred to the complexity already, motivations, interests, the future power structure, solvability, is usually not addressed in these news broadcasts. There's only a very secondary emphasis on the price that is paid for the conflict, on victimhood, and many other discourses are being excluded, including more pacifist discourses. Does that mean, and this is a list that I want to show you, but I won't discuss it, this is famously known as my wish list. I think there is a need to rethink journalism when we're looking at the way that journalism and news broadcasts more specifically is representing conflict. Not just when these specific news broadcasting stations are involved in the conflict, even in cases where they are symbolically involved, where they're part of the West, we see that this dichotomized way of representing conflict is still very, very strong and comes with a very, very high price. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Carpentier, and I hope that you will be able to answer questions after the presentations are over. And it's my pleasure now to present Dr. Vaia Doudaki, who is a lecturer in media and journalism in the Department of Communications and Internet Studies in the Cyprus University of Technology, where she also coordinates their master's program in European journalism. Her research deals with content, both fiction and news, and also she is a research coordinator in the conflict and violence in Cyprus television project, also a partner in the Worlds of Journalism study, and a member of the research group of World Internet Project Cyprus, which is undertaken with the assistance of the University of Southern California Annenberg School Center for Digital Future in the US. She will speak about community media for reconciliation, a Cypriot case study. Dr. Doudaki.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Professor Nosek and Commerce University. It is really nice to be here. I will talk to you about a case study of a community media organization and the strategies it uses to deal with conflict. Well, community media in general are described as the organizations that serve the community by providing content relevant to the needs of the members of the community while promoting access and participation of the members of the community. Community media are a very wide variety of media organization structures, and they can take many forms, and they can use different technological platforms, print, radio, web, or mixed. Despite their broad range and their differences, they share some basic characteristics which distinguish them from other types of media organizations like the commercial media or even the public media. Especially their close connection to the civil society and their strong commitment to participation and democracy in both their internal decision-making practices and also their intercultural logic and logic of participation. These are the key characteristics that distinguish them from, let's say, the other two types, the commercial media and the public media, and this is why they're called the third sector. We can see this, the social relevance of community media organization, I think, can be represented in the four approaches that are usually to study community media. The first is the community approach, that the community media serve the community as they focus on participation of the community, the opportunity given to the everyday, to the ordinary people to have their voices heard, and to the empowerment of the community members. The alternative, the second approach, the alternative approach sees community media as an alternative to the mainstream media, both in terms of organization, as they usually use a more democratic, a more horizontal democratic structure, and also apart from organizing also in terms of content. The civil society approach focuses on how the community media are intertwined with civil society, and civil society agendas are concerned with enabling citizens to be active in many of the microspheres that are relevant to everyday life, but also to facilitate macro participation in the different societal groups in the public debate. And the fourth approach is a rhizomatic approach, who uses the Deleuze's and Guattari's metaphor, and focuses on three aspects of community media: their elusive nature, their interconnections, both amongst each other, but also with the civil society, and the linkages with the market and the state. Under this aspect, under this view, the community media work as rhizomes that tend to cut across borders and build linkages between pre-existing gaps. Because of these characteristics and the field that community media provide for dialogue and participation, and as they work as internal meeting places and places where the voices of the members are expressed, they are considered good privileged partners, I would say, for peace building, conflict resolution, and reconciliation. However, there's not much academic research regarding this dimension of community media, even though there are different projects, especially by UNESCO, AMARC, and the UN. One of the few exceptions is Rodriguez's work, who studies community media, or citizens media, as she calls them. And one of her major conclusions is that, concerning the citizens media in Colombia, instead of transmitting messages about peace building to audiences, she says, community and citizens media involve audiences in and subject audiences to the felt and embodied experience of peace. So her main point is that community media can have power in the performance of peace, in the performance on peace building. So I will come to our case study, which is research done by Professor Carpentier and me in the Cyprus Community Media Center. Cyprus, as you know, is a divided country since 1974. So there is a long-lasting conflict. It has been divided geographically and ethnically after the invasion of Turkey and the occupation of a part of the island. As you see in the map, the north part is the part where the Turkish Cypriots live, and the south part is the part that the Greek Cypriots live. And you see the line, it's called the green line, that separates the island. There have been some efforts of reunification, of a peace, and the most widely known to you also is probably the Annan Plan, but it has failed. So until today, Cyprus is practically divided. As you can understand, the Cypriot media are intertwined with the Cyprus problem. And especially the mainstream media do not foster reconciliation between the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot community, but rather they embrace conflict-centered approaches to peace efforts. And practically they help in the deepening of the intra and inter-community polarization, serving the binary oppositional scheme of us versus them. coming to our case study, the Cyprus Community Media Center, I have to say that actually there is no explicit recognition, official recognition of community media in Cyprus until today in both communities, in both parts of the island, even though there have been some efforts now, some moves towards that direction from the Greek Cypriot legislator. Nevertheless, in 2009, the Cyprus Community Media Center was created, and it is actually the first community media organization on the island. It is not a traditional community media itself. It is actually financed by UNDP, and it fulfills its mission by providing training, loaning equipment to members, creating productions for local organizations, staging events, and offering in general media advice to its members. As we see in its foundation charter, some of its core values, we see that it has as a principle, as a target, to unite people and communities through community media based on coexistence, dialogue, inclusion, reconciliation, and respect for diversity, and value and respect the contributions of all people in society, and aim to provide a forum for diversity, multiculturalism, and social inclusion through community media production based on creativity, dialogue, and innovation. The aim of our study, as I mentioned earlier, was to analyze the role this community media organization can play. Only 2 minutes? In reconciliation. So the analyzed material is interviews with the staff members and internal documents of the organization. So since I don't have much time, I will briefly inform you on the strategies, the conflict and transformation strategies it uses. We found that it implements some general strategies and some more community media linked strategies. The general strategies are capacity building and skill enhancement of its members. It has a network of 30 civil society actors, NGOs, Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriots, that are active in health, environment, reconciliation, etc., and provides support in communicating their message to the wider audience. And it does that through training, through loaning equipment, through taking photographs, through holding events, or setting online forums. Another strategy is to bridge the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot community on the island. The very physicality of the center, it is on the green zone. It's a neutral place. It plays a significant role in that. So the notions of co-presence, collaboration, and co-production are seen as important conflict resolution mechanisms. As the project manager said in his interview, he said, so that we now we have been able to link people together who share a common interest that still may not agree on a political level, but they can humanize the other through their co-shared interests. Another strategy used by CCMC is to both produce alternative media content and affect the content of mainstream media. So the general idea is to bring into the public content that has a more diverse and a less conflictious representation of the island. So it has a production of its own, even though it's not a media organization, and it establishes partnerships with the mainstream media. Okay, I will have to sum up. Briefly, two other conflict transformation strategies that are directly linked to community media practices. It's self-production, as I told you. It's not. It produces its own content, and it has it supports the development of community media legislation on the island and the establishment of itself, of community, the Cyprus Community Media Center as a representative body of community media on the island. So I suppose I don't have enough time. We can discuss more things later.
We'll have to be able to during our questions and answers